Who doesn't love action, adventure, and a bit of revenge, especially when it involves the regression of a fallen prince? Today, we're diving into an epic story about a character named Yuri, the third prince of the Briole kingdom. Betrayed by the woman he loved. Forced to watch his kingdom burn to ashes. His family, his friends, even his most loyal allies, were all wiped out by his lover's empire. But fate gives him a second chance. Reincarnated at the age of 13, Yuri is determined to change everything and stop the destruction of his kingdom. Hey everyone, I'm Ronnie, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're talking about a brand new manhwa titled The Third Prince of the Fallen Kingdom Has Regressed. Let's jump right into how this incredible story begins.
During the winter season, inside a dimly lit tavern filled with the scent of smoke and ale, a man leaned closer to his friend and asked if he had heard the story about a madman who charged recklessly through battlefields during the war. His friend looked puzzled and asked what madman he was referring to. The man explained that the figure in question was just a mercenary, nothing more. But unlike most, he fought as if he didn't care whether he lived or died. Once a battle ended, he would immediately begin searching for the next one, never stopping to rest. According to the tales, every time a war concluded, he would mutter the same words with bitter laughter, "Damn, I lived again." He added that if a war involved the empire, the man was guaranteed to show up. People said it didn't even look like he was fighting for money anymore. Instead, it was as if he was gathering revenge rather than gold. Hearing this, the friend asked who the man was. The storyteller admitted he wasn't sure. The rumors only said that the mercenary was once a prince of a fallen kingdom. Now, it seemed, he was simply searching for a place to die. In a snowy field, a knight clad in armor turned to another man and asked, "So, the solution you've come to at the end, is it really self-sacrifice, Third Prince of Briole, Yuri Briole?" Yuri stood still, haunted by the dishonorable name of the very man who had brought his kingdom to ruin. It was the name of a sinner, and the sole survivor of the fallen kingdom. 10 years earlier, at a casino, an 18-year-old Yuri was euphoric from his continuous winning streak. The court mage, Ernado, expressed his admiration, remarking how impressive Yuri's luck was. Yuri replied casually that it was just luck, nothing special. As two other gamblers at the table stood up to leave, Yuri stopped them, asking if they were done already, saying he wanted to raise the stakes and play another round. Ernado, however, reminded him they needed to go soon or they'd be late. The gamblers warned Yuri to walk away while he still could, accusing him of cheating with dirty tricks. Enraged, Yuri slammed the table and demanded to know if they had any idea who he was. They scoffed, saying that with his behavior, he couldn't possibly be a noble, maybe a wannabe king. They mocked the royal family, claiming that a household obsessed with swords was destined to fall, and added that provoking the empire was reckless. Yuri flipped the table in a fit of rage, startling them. Wiping his face, he declared that he was the third prince of Briole, and that they would be reborn by his hand. Without hesitation, he killed the three men. Later that night, Yuri met with a girl, explaining that he was late because his father had called an emergency meeting. He'd sent word via pigeon and asked for her forgiveness. She was Yekaterina Ivarna Granzine, a princess of the empire. She retorted that she, too, was busy and had gone through great effort to meet him while avoiding everyone. Yuri admitted that he wasn't even supposed to be sharing this information. Yekaterina looked at him coldly and asked if she was just another person to him. Nervously, Yuri denied it. She threw back the necklace he had given her, demanding to know why he had given it if he didn't trust her. She told him not to contact her again, she would reach out if and when she chose to. As she turned and left, Yuri called out to her, but she didn't stop. Alone, he muttered that it seemed she wouldn't forgive him this time, unaware that someone had been secretly watching, and smiling ominously. From that day on, the already fragile relationship between the empire and Briole disintegrated entirely. With only minimal provocation, the empire began closing off borders, and tensions escalated. One day, news reached Yuri, the empire had invaded. The castle grounds were evacuated, and the war began. Yuri watched helplessly as the entire castle was burned down before his eyes. Years passed in the endless war. Countless lives were lost. Yuri's close comrades died one after another, some urging him to escape and asking where the reinforcements were. Without the continent's strongest warrior, Fiore Briole, Yuri's father, Briole's forces began to crumble. At first, Yuri believed it was all a tragic coincidence. Perhaps he simply didn't want to face the truth. But when he looked back on his past, on all the battles, betrayals, and bloodshed, only one conclusion made sense: Yekaterina had betrayed him. She had been the only person he confided in, and the invasion began right after his father left Briole. Still, he clung to hope. Maybe he was just overthinking. But when Yekaterina's cold response finally reached him, that hope shattered into despair. During one battle, a soldier spotted Yuri and claimed that Briole would fall if they managed to kill him. Yuri, feeling the weight of endless war, responded by charging into battle and cutting them down. Amid the chaos, he heard someone calling his name, and suddenly awoke. Yuri suddenly opened his eyes, startled by the sound of someone calling his name. Standing before him was a familiar man, his father, who told him in disbelief that he had been asleep for 3 days. The man asked if he was feeling all right. Yuri, still in a daze, called out, "Father?" Confusion overtook him. He had been certain his father was dead. How could he be here now? A chilling possibility struck him, and he muttered that perhaps he had indeed ended up in hell after all. His father frowned and asked what nonsense he was talking about. Clutching his father's hand tightly, Yuri said that it made sense. For someone who always preached about honor and righteousness, surely his father had lived a decent life. In response, his father struck him lightly on the head and told him to stop spouting nonsense. Yuri winced, half joking that even in hell, his father still hadn't fixed his habit of hitting him. He urged the older man to repent, it wasn't too late yet. Then he glanced out the window, expecting flames and torment, but what he saw instead was a calm, peaceful landscape. The skies were clear, the trees green, and maids were walking along the road with smiles on their faces. He whispered in shock that they weren't here. This couldn't be hell. There were no flames of sin, no demons mocking and tormenting him. It didn't make sense. His vision blurred. The world tilted. Before everything faded to black, he heard the voices of his father and brothers calling his name. When he opened his eyes again, he realized he had returned to the body of his 13-year-old self. At first, Yuri believed it to be a dream, or some strange, lingering déjà vu. But no matter how many times he pinched himself, he didn't wake up. The world didn't vanish. Instead, long-forgotten events and memories began unfolding exactly as they had before. It was undeniable now. He had returned to the past, the spring of the year he turned 13. He had been given another chance. The next morning, Aina opened the window and cheerfully called out that it was time for sword training. Yuri quickly sat up and asked her to prepare his clothes. Aina chuckled, told him to calm down, and moved to help him wash his face. As she leaned closer, Yuri suddenly fell silent. Her face brought back a vivid image, her motionless body lying in the hallway, blood pooling beneath her. The memory struck him like a dagger. After a moment, he looked at her and called her name. Then he said, softly but seriously, that she should slap him across the face. Aina froze. "Are you telling me to commit treason?" Yuri answered that it wouldn't be treason if he ordered it. He leaned toward her. A loud slap echoed through the mansion. Later, at the Imperial training ground, Yuri practiced swordsmanship while thinking to himself that he had forgotten how strong Aina could be. The burning sting on his cheek remained, but no one offered him ointment. Not even Bernard, who didn't comment on his form or stance, he simply made him spar as usual. Yuri wondered when training had become nothing more than endless sparring. Then he remembered Bernard's words to his father long ago, that Yuri was born with talent but wasted it, and that if he'd only been more disciplined, he could have become Briole's greatest blessing. It had all started there. Instead of using those words as motivation, Yuri had become even lazier, refusing to cooperate with his instructors. That was why they'd reduced training to simple sparring. But now he was different. He turned to Bernard and told him that starting today, he wanted to learn properly. From this moment on, he would give his all. Bernard eyed him curiously and said he didn't know what had gotten into Yuri, but if he meant it, then his real training would begin. With that, Bernard dashed forward with a wooden sword. Yuri shouted for him to wait, but Bernard only smirked and advanced. As Yuri scrambled to meet his attack, he remembered something else. Bernard had once been known as the Sword Demon before coming to Briole. Soon, the sharp clashing of wooden swords rang through the air. Yuri found himself knocked to the ground, gasping for breath. He thought that if he didn't have experience as a mercenary from his past life, he might have been thoroughly defeated. This was exhausting, but he could feel it. This training would help him grow quickly. It wasn't bad at all. Meanwhile, Bernard was silently amazed. Yuri had blocked every one of his strikes. When had the boy improved so much? Just then, Aina rushed over and called for Yuri. She said he needed to come immediately, his father was looking for him. Curious, Yuri asked why. Aina informed him that Count Johns and his son had arrived. The name sent a chill down Yuri's spine. Count Johns' son, Got Barkvar. The man who, in Yuri's previous life, had betrayed the kingdom and opened the gates to the empire. That bastard was here? Yuri's expression darkened as he asked Aina where Got was right now. At the dining table, the family and guests gathered for a meal. Count Johns remarked on how much Yuri had changed, complimenting his improved physique. Yuri's father responded dryly that the boy must have eaten something strange. The count laughed and said he would like to get the same for his own son. Yuri's father diplomatically said that the count's son was intelligent as well. But the count waved it off, admitting his son still had much to learn. Got Barkvar smiled brightly at the first prince but shrank back in fear when Yuri shot him a piercing glare. Noticing the tension, Yuri's second brother leaned over and asked if something had happened between Yuri and Got. Yuri replied bluntly that Got had stabbed him in the back. The second prince gave him a pointed look. And you're just going to leave him alone? You're Yuri Briole, aren't you? Yuri stared at Got, who continued to pretend to be dignified while darting nervous glances around the table. He hadn't changed at all. Got's own expression twisted into a scowl as he returned Yuri's glare. Yuri told his brother that he didn't plan to leave the matter alone. He would deal with it, but not out of anger. This was for Got's own good. He had to fix that man before it was too late. The last life must not repeat itself. Thinking back, Yuri recalled fighting Got around this same time in his previous life. The duel had seemed petty then, almost like a scribbled note in the grander story. But now he wondered, could that old grudge have been what led Got to betray the kingdom? Without warning, Yuri tossed a wooden sword at Got Barkvar and told him to prepare for a duel. He declared that in this kingdom, there was no place for narrow-minded knights. Got stared at him, visibly unsettled, and reminded Yuri that he wasn't even an official knight yet. But Yuri replied that he was someone destined to become a knight, one who would serve the kingdom. Got admitted that, technically, Yuri wasn't wrong. But before he could finish, Yuri lunged forward, shouting that this was a duel. Caught off guard, Got raised his weapon just in time to block the first strike and shouted that Yuri was a coward for ambushing him. Yuri, unfazed, stepped back swiftly, kicked up a clump of dirt, and hurled it into Got's eyes. Blinded, Got shouted that Yuri had broken the knight's code and had no right to be a knight. But Yuri was already charging again. He threw his wooden sword aside and dashed forward with full speed. With one swift motion, he kicked Got in the chest, sending him flying across the training ground. Got hit the ground with a dull thud. Yuri didn't stop. He grabbed Got's dropped wooden sword and pressed its tip against his neck. His thoughts raced. In the previous life, this very man had sold out his father's honor to the empire in exchange for information. Yuri looked down at him coldly and asked why, if his father was a respected count and a knight of high standing, titles and positions like that even existed. Got couldn't answer. He lay speechless on the ground. Yuri tilted his head and asked if the question was too difficult. Got mumbled that he wasn't quite sure what Yuri meant. He asked who had given his father that title, who had granted him that power. He then told God to reflect on his words, to seek out the essence in them. Only by doing that would he understand what true nobility was meant to be. God quietly said that he would think about it and stood up to leave. Watching him go, Yuri's second brother walked over and commented with mild surprise that he hadn't known Yuri was actually good at fighting. Yuri raised an eyebrow and asked if his brother had thought he'd lose. The second prince grinned and admitted that yes, he had. Yuri asked him seriously who he thought he was. His brother answered without hesitation, who else? The kingdom's biggest troublemaker and gambler. Yuri gave a tired sigh and said that he wasn't going to live like that anymore. He added that his brother should stop fooling around too. The second prince blinked, clearly taken aback, and asked if something had come loose in Yuri's brain. That evening, after an exhausting day of training, Yuri lay sprawled on the ground, breathing heavily. Bernard approached and told him they should stop there for the day. Then, after a pause, Bernard called Yuri's name and said it was about time he started learning a mana technique. Yuri looked up and asked if Bernard would be teaching him his method. But Bernard shook his head and replied that his own method wasn't suited for Yuri. He recommended that Yuri begin with the official Briole method. Yuri fell silent for a moment. In his past life, he had indeed mastered the Briole method. As a mercenary, he had risen to the very edge of its limits. But this time, he wanted more. Bernard noticed his hesitation and asked if he was considering another option. Yuri admitted he was still thinking it over. Then he asked Bernard to recommend someone from the royal guard, not necessarily someone skilled already, but someone with exceptional potential. There was still one more technique Yuri hadn't even tried in his last life. Bernard thought for a moment before saying that, in terms of pure potential, Jared stood out the most. Yuri repeated the name slowly, Jared. He remembered meeting Jared near the end of the war in his previous life. Back then, Jared's skills had been mediocre, so much so that it had been a mystery how he survived for so long. But perhaps it was due to raw, untapped talent that had never been sharpened properly. Yuri recalled the man saying that if he could go back in time, he would have trained like hell. Yuri scoffed inwardly. He had told Jared then to stop spouting nonsense. When the war came, they had both turned into nothing more than rusted swords. But now, in this life, things were different. Yuri slowly stood up from the ground and told Bernard that he needed to meet this so-called potential knight. He thought to himself that it was time to knock some sense into Jared. That evening, inside the Royal Knight's training grounds, Yuri entered quietly. Sir Rosso noticed him and greeted him with a respectful nod, asking what brought him there at this hour. Yuri replied that he had come to see how the knights were training. Sir Rosso smiled and said that everyone was working hard. Yuri then asked where Jared was. The rookie? Sir Rosso asked. He's over there. Following Rosso's gaze, Yuri spotted the young man. As he observed Jared, he began to understand what Bernard had meant. Though Jared was participating in the drills, he was clearly only doing the bare minimum. His movements were just enough to pass, but no more. Yuri muttered to himself, so this is how he became a rusty sword. He turned to Rosso and asked for a wooden sword. He said he wanted to spar. Rosso raised a brow. And who do you plan to spar with? Yuri pointed across the field without hesitation. That slacker over there, he said flatly. Soon after, Yuri and Jared stood opposite each other on the training ground, each holding a wooden sword. The knights around them cheered Jared on, telling him to stay sharp and do his best. Yuri looked at him and said he had heard Jared possessed great potential as a knight. He asked to be shown just what kind of knight he really was. Jared nodded respectfully and said he understood. Yuri dashed forward with a grin, adding that he hoped Jared wouldn't disappoint him. Jared responded with a casual swing of his sword, as if it were a routine exercise. Someone from the sidelines commented, impressed, that Jared's movements were sharp and precise, as expected of him. Sir Rosso called out to Yuri, telling him to hang in there. But Jared soon began to sense something strange. Every time their swords clashed, the distance between them remained oddly consistent. He realized that Yuri was deliberately adjusting his pace to match his. Yuri suddenly muttered that this was too boring, and asked if he could go all out now. Before Jared could react, Yuri launched a serious attack. Jared barely managed to block it. Yuri noted to himself that Jared's reflexes were beast-like, just as Bernard had said. Then Yuri increased the intensity of his attacks, striking fiercely and relentlessly. Jared struggled to keep up. He thought Yuri had been holding back earlier, but clearly, that was no longer the case. Jared retaliated with greater force, but Yuri saw through the attempt. Despite having memories from his previous life, Yuri didn't expect to win outright. Jared was still a knight, after all. Even so, Yuri aimed carefully and struck Jared's hand, finally landing a clean hit. He beamed with satisfaction. The surrounding knights burst into murmurs of disbelief, saying they couldn't believe the third prince's attack had actually worked. Yuri turned to Jared and asked if he had been holding back. Jared replied honestly, not at all. But internally, Jared felt confused. He was clearly pressing the prince with serious technique, yet it felt as though he was the one being driven back. The next exchange was even closer. Jared barely dodged an attack that nearly grazed his neck. Yuri clicked his tongue and said that it was close, but he had missed. Frustrated, he began channeling mana into his wooden sword. On the sidelines, the knights gasped. "Has he lost his mind?" one of them exclaimed. "He's using a mana method against the third prince." Another shouted at Jared to snap out of it, telling him to stop immediately. By the time Jared regained control of himself, the damage had been done. His enhanced strike had been dodged, but a thin line of blood was now trailing down Yuri's forehead. Jared rushed forward, his expression filled with concern, and asked if Yuri was all right. Sir Rosso also stepped in quickly, voicing his worry. But Yuri simply wiped the blood from his forehead and said that he was fine. This, he insisted, was what real sparring looked like. Then, turning to Jared, he told him to pick up his sword again. It was just starting to get fun. As the spar resumed, Yuri charged forward, striking fiercely. He told Jared there was no reason to stop now. His intensity didn't fade. In fact, it only grew stronger as he began to corner his opponent. Jared, feeling the pressure, realized the difference between himself and the prince. Yuri was pushing himself to the absolute limit, and beyond it. He wasn't simply fighting. He was driving himself with every strike, every motion. They stood opposite each other once more, and Jared's pulse quickened. For the first time in a long while, he felt his blood boiling. He hadn't even felt this way against stronger opponents. And yet, this young prince was stirring something deep within him, a sensation both thrilling and unsettling. Yuri attacked again, swinging at Jared's neck, but Jared managed to duck just in time. Annoyed, Jared tightened his grip and retaliated with a forceful strike that landed on Yuri's wooden sword. A crack split through the air. The sword broke cleanly down the middle. Jared froze. Yuri looked at the broken weapon in his hand and then smiled. He declared that the match was over. Jared had won. Then he extended his hand and said he had learned something from Jared today. Jared accepted the handshake and replied that he had learned something as well. As their hands met, Jared couldn't help but reflect. Yuri was radiating a fighting spirit and raw determination unlike anything he'd ever encountered before. It amazed him. How could a young prince fight with such obsession? But Yuri raised an eyebrow and asked what Jared was standing around for. He had just made a prince bleed, was he going to just stand there? Startled, Jared quickly apologized and ran off to get something for Yuri's wound. Yuri collapsed to the ground, completely exhausted. As he lay there staring up at the sky, he noticed the other knights cheering and clapping. Their reaction brought a faint smile to his face. Sir Rosso looked over at someone who had just arrived and called out, "Captain." Yuri lifted his head slightly and asked when the man had arrived. The captain replied calmly that he had just gotten there and had been watching. That man was Saint, the captain of Brunei's royal guard. As he observed Yuri lying on the ground, his expression became unreadable, thoughtful, perhaps even impressed. A few days later, Jared was walking down a quiet corridor when a familiar voice called out to him. Yuri. Jared froze for a moment before turning in surprise. Yuri approached and asked if Jared had just finished his shift. Still surprised, Jared nodded and asked what the prince wanted. Yuri told him there was somewhere they needed to go today, and Jared should come with him. Jared hesitated and replied that he had training to do. But Yuri waved it off and said his neck was still intact thanks to Jared, so he ought to repay that debt. Jared sighed in resignation and said he understood. As they walked, Yuri reflected to himself that his strength had recovered a little. It still wasn't enough, but for now, it would do. Jared finally asked where they were going. Yuri told him to keep quiet and follow. Jared narrowed his eyes and asked if Yuri was planning something dangerous, because if so, he wasn't coming. Yuri chuckled and reassured him, saying they wouldn't be alone. They were bringing one more person with them. Curious, Jared asked who. At that moment, a voice called out behind them. Yuri shouted for Ernado, Brunei's royal court mage. When Ernado appeared and asked why he'd been summoned, Yuri told him he needed his assistance for an outing. But Ernado shook his head. He said he had somewhere to be and couldn't go with them. Yuri crossed his arms and, with a sly grin, reminded him of something important. He still owed Yuri a gambling debt. That made Ernado freeze mid-step. He turned back and asked if Yuri was being serious. Yuri replied that he was. He even said he'd cover the debt from the last time. He asked Ernado if he had ever known him to lie. Ernado raised an eyebrow and said that outside the gambling den? Yes. Absolutely. Yuri laughed and admitted Ernado was right. But he swore he'd pay off the debt, so Ernado should come along. Ernado rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said that if that was the case, Yuri should sign a binding contract. Yuri stood frozen, baffled. Was the title of Brunei's third prince really worth that little? He turned to Jared and told him to act as the guarantor. Jared recoiled. What are you talking about? Yuri quickly clarified, he only meant for Jared to be a witness to his words, not actually guarantee anything. That seemed to satisfy Ernado, who finally agreed to go with them. He then asked where they were going, since Yuri had brought both a knight and a mage along. Yuri grinned and told them that their destination was the Sword Mountain. He added, without hesitation, from now on, we're heading to loot the Ancestors' dungeon. Inside a gloomy tunnel beneath the palace, Ernado glanced around and muttered that he had never known a passage like this even existed. Jared, walking just behind Yuri, asked where the tunnel led. Yuri replied that it led to Sword Mountain. Jared paused, surprised. Sword Mountain? The one from the legend? The place tied to the progenitor of Briole? Yuri nodded. In his previous life, after the Empire had conquered Briole, a hidden dungeon had been discovered inside Sword Mountain. According to the rumors at the time, the legacy of Briole's progenitor had been excavated from within that dungeon, causing a major uproar. The tunnel they now traveled through had originally been designed only as an escape route, an emergency passage the royal family had never needed. Because of that, the Empire had claimed Briole's ancient legacy before it could even be used. But this life was different. Back then, he had been running away. But this time, Yuri swore to himself he would move forward. No matter what. He would see with his own eyes what legacy his ancestors had left behind. At the end of the tunnel, Yuri opened a heavy door sealed with ancient mechanisms. Sunlight spilled through as they emerged into a dense forest. Ernado squinted at the sunlight and asked if Sword Mountain was straight ahead from there. Then he narrowed his eyes and asked where Yuri had gotten the key to open that door. After all, it was supposed to be a protected artifact. Yuri thought to himself that the key had been hidden in the same place as in his past life, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the palace's study room. But aloud, he told Ernado coolly that it wasn't his business. As Ernado pushed aside some underbrush, he winced, his hand had been cut by sharp-edged leaves. Yuri turned and warned both of them to be careful. The forest plants here had razor-thin leaves. He told them to follow him closely. Ornado grumbled, and turning to Jared, whispered, "Has Yuri been eating something strange lately?" Jared shrugged. "It does seem that way." Yuri, hearing them talk behind him, urged them to hurry. Ornado muttered that at least Yuri's temperament hadn't changed one bit. Suddenly, Yuri came to a stop and held out his hand for silence. He told them there was a pack of direwolves nearby. They were moving in formation. He couldn't be sure how many there were, but there had to be more hidden nearby. Ornado asked, surprised, how Yuri could know that. Yuri simply said he had read it in a book. Ornado's eyes widened. "You? Read a book?" Yuri ignored the jab and explained that the wolves didn't notice them yet. So he advised them to pass quietly. But at that exact moment, Ornado stepped on a dry branch. It cracked loudly. Everyone froze. Ornado gave a nervous laugh. Then, out of nowhere, a dire wolf lunged at him from behind. Jared reacted instantly. He drew his sword and cut the beast down before it could sink its teeth into the mage. The wolf's body landed heavily beside Ornado. Yuri nodded in approval and praised Jared's swift use of mana, but added grimly that the sound had drawn the alpha's attention. A loud, guttural howl echoed through the forest. The alpha summoned the pack. Within moments, the three were surrounded. Jared moved in front of the others and told them to stay behind him. The wolves didn't hesitate, they attacked ruthlessly. With a wide arc of his blade, Jared struck down two of them. Watching him fight, Ornado commented to Yuri that Jared was indeed strong, as expected from a royal guard of Briole. Yuri agreed, though he added that Jared still wasn't quite good enough. The tide of wolves made things harder. Jared was beginning to struggle to hold them off on his own. Yuri turned to Ornado and reminded him that his father had placed great trust in his magical ability. It was time for him to prove it. Ornado began casting, summoning flames into his hands. "Did you bring me here just to turn me into a battle mage?" he asked. Jared overheard them and shouted, "What are you two talking about?" Then he noticed a massive fireball flying straight toward him. Quickly, Jared pulled his sword out of a wolf's mouth and leapt backward. The fireball landed with a deafening boom, incinerating the area with a massive explosion. Looking at the horizon, Jared muttered that he hadn't expected monsters other than direwolves to appear. Although those monsters delayed the time, they finally stood atop the peak of Sword Mountain. Jared looked around in disbelief. He said he couldn't believe they were truly at the summit. Yuri, however, remained confident. He assured Jared this was the right place. Jared frowned. "If this really is the Sword Mountain, shouldn't we be seeing something?" Just then, Yuri's gaze sharpened. He spotted something in the ground, just barely visible. He pointed it out and told Jared they needed to pull it out. Jared called over to Ornado for help, but Ornado quickly declined, saying that wounds on a mage's hands were disgraceful. With some effort, Yuri and Jared dug around the object and uncovered what looked like the hilt of a buried sword. Yuri grabbed the handle and slowly pulled the blade from the ground. He couldn't help but smile. The sword was in pristine condition, gleaming, untarnished. Ornado looked closer and remarked that it didn't look buried at all. It looked like it had just been forged. But Yuri wasn't focused on the blade itself anymore, he had noticed something engraved on it. A guilt-marked emblem. Jared asked if this was the founder's relic. Yuri said he wasn't sure. But before either of them could say more, the ground suddenly began to tremble beneath their feet. Yuri turned to Jared and said that they were about to find out. A crack split the ground. The peak of Sword Mountain burst open, splitting in two. And the three of them began to fall into the darkness below. With a loud crash, the two of them landed hard on the stone floor. They had fallen into an underground dungeon. When Yuri opened his eyes, he found himself lying on top of Jared. It seemed Jared had used his mana method just in time to protect both of them from the impact. Moments later, Ornado came tumbling down, groaning that the fall had been deeper than he'd expected. Yuri sat up and narrowed his eyes at him, asking if Ornado had ignored his own safety just to save himself. Ernado brushed the dust off and muttered that it had been an emergency situation. But before Yuri could continue scolding him, Ernado suddenly froze and pointed behind Yuri, shouting at him to look. Yuri raised an eyebrow, clearly not falling for the distraction. "Changing the topic won't work on me," he said. But Ernado insisted, his voice had turned serious. "I'm not joking. It's a ghost." Yuri turned around, and his expression instantly darkened. A man clad in blackened knight armor was walking toward them, his body surrounded by a dark aura. His eyes glowed a sinister red. Yuri's heart tightened. It was a Death Knight. He called to Jared to get up, but when Jared didn't respond, he kicked his leg to rouse him. Jared stirred, and the moment he caught sight of the Death Knight, he immediately stepped in front of Yuri and declared that he would deal with it. Yuri couldn't help but be impressed. Jared reacted quickly. As the name suggested, a Death Knight was a warrior who had returned from death, stronger than they had ever been in life. But Yuri held up a hand and told them that this particular one wasn't dangerous. Jared glanced at him in disbelief and asked how he could possibly know that. Yuri replied that he could feel it. He was guarding the Founder's dungeon. And there was no way he would be hostile towards someone of the Founder's bloodline. He stepped forward and asked the Death Knight directly if he was right. But instead of answering, the Death Knight silently drew his sword and stabbed it into the ground. Alarmed, Jared and Ernado shouted for Yuri to get back. Ernado, gaping, said he couldn't believe Yuri's head had been split in half. Yuri scowled and told him to watch his mouth. Ernado corrected himself, saying he meant his hair had been split in half. Then, the Death Knight finally spoke. His deep voice echoed through the chamber as he remarked that Yuri's condescending attitude was just like his. Yuri narrowed his eyes. "Who are you talking about?" The Death Knight answered, "Eric Briole." Jared asked, "Who's Eric Briole?" Ernado responded quietly, as if reciting from memory. Anyone from the Briole royal family would know. Eric Briole was a peerless swordsman. He conquered the continent with a single sword. He was the founder of Briole, the land of knights. Its first king. Yuri's voice grew cautious as he asked if he had been the first to come to this place. The Death Knight nodded. Only a true descendant of Briole could draw that sword. No one else. Yuri looked down at the sword he had pulled from the earth. Is this truly the treasured sword wielded by the founder himself? The Death Knight replied that it was his. Then, seeing Yuri's conflicted expression, asked if there was a problem with it. Yuri shook his head and said he simply felt guilty for touching his belongings. The Death Knight stepped forward and addressed Yuri as a true descendant of Briole. Then he asked if Yuri was the reason for coming here. Yuri stood tall and declared, "I am Yuri Briole, Third Prince of Briole and rightful heir of Eric Briole. I've come to accept the Founder's legacy." The Death Knight slowly began walking backward. He said the time had come to fulfill his final duty, he would grant Yuri what he sought. Yuri followed without hesitation. Jared stood in place, stunned. They had entered the legendary Founder's dungeon, and now they were conversing with a Death Knight? This was nothing like the life of a royal guard he'd envisioned. Yuri turned around and called Jared, asking why he was just standing there. Jared blinked, realizing he had spaced out. Was he truly seeing all of this? He nodded and said he was coming. The Death Knight led them to a massive blue crystal lodged in stone. Then he sat on a nearby rock, and a cool breeze of mana began to radiate through the air. He turned to the group and said he hoped they were worthy. The next moment, Yuri found himself standing in the middle of a desert. He looked around and muttered, "Where am I?" In the distance, he saw a figure holding a sword. At first, he thought it might be the Founder himself, but as he looked closer, he realized that figure wasn't human. It charged at him, and Yuri barely managed to block the first strike. Then he noticed mana gathering around the figure's abdomen. Yuri's eyes widened, it was a mana method. The figure pointed the condensed mana toward its chest, channeled it, and then transferred it into its sword in a seamless motion. Yuri was stunned. This was no ordinary combat, it was a demonstration. The figure was showing him how to circulate mana itself. Then the figure turned and pointed at Yuri. He got the message. You want me to copy that? Right now? In the middle of a fight? Yuri laughed aloud. My ancestor must have been insane. To think he would train someone who hadn't even learned a mana method by tossing them into live combat. It was something only a reincarnator like him could possibly endure. He began gathering mana in his hand, trying to mimic the motion. Was it done like this? He muttered, still adjusting. Yuri called that and said, he doesn't know what to do after that, so we'll do it my way. He steadied his stance. I have to get stronger. The Empire will one day show its ambition and invade Briole again. I won't let history repeat itself. His sword gleamed in the desert light as he focused. The swordsmanship of Eric Briole. He lunged forward. I'll absorb it all. Elsewhere, Jared awoke in a strange space surrounded by swords and bows. He looked around and realized it resembled a training ground, but he was alone. Gripping his sword tightly, he called out. Are you hiding? Come at me. He heard footsteps behind him and spun around, only to freeze in shock. Standing before him was himself. A doppelganger? Was this the Death Knight's test? Jared demanded to know the figure's name. Are you also Jared? The doppelganger only replied, do not defy your fate. Jared frowned. What are you talking about? The copy told him not to join the royal guard simply to live a comfortable life. He warned Jared to stay away from the Third Prince. The more he resisted his destiny, the more miserable his life would become. Jared took a deep breath. In the past, he might have agreed. But as memories of sparring with Yuri surfaced, he smiled. That proves you're not the real me, he said. A sword once swung cannot be taken back. Dwelling on a missed strike only clouds the mind. The doppelganger sneered. What an arrogant way of thinking. Then he charged forward with an ore-cloaked blade. Jared blocked him and analyzed his technique. The strikes were simple. Defensive. Cowardly. Just like his former self. With a sharp motion, he counterattacked. The old me was boring. His blade found its mark. The doppelganger collapsed, and from his wound, a slimy black substance began to leak. That slime expanded rapidly, taking on a monstrous form. Jared narrowed his eyes. So this is your true identity? The massive creature loomed over him, its flames crackling violently. Jared steadied his sword. Yuri, he thought, I hope you're holding your own. On Yuri's side of the desert, sword marks were carved into every rock, a silent testament to the intense battle that had taken place. He sat quietly beside one of those scarred stones while a shadowy figure approached him with slow but deliberate steps. As that figure prepared another strike, Yuri didn't move. He simply sat, calm and still. But just as the figure drew near, Yuri suddenly gripped his sword tightly, poured mana into its blade, and swung it with immense force. The impact created a powerful mana blast that sent the figure flying backward. Yuri wondered how much time had passed. Things had nearly gotten dangerous just now. But thanks to all the sparring, he had finally learned how to control the mana method, and how to wield his sword properly. When he looked again at the figure, he saw its sword begin to crack. As the blade shattered and fell apart, the figure itself also began to fade away. With a parting smile, the figure told Yuri goodbye. As Yuri, too, began to disappear, he understood what it meant. So, the time was up. He thanked the figure sincerely. Moments later, Yuri found himself standing back in the place he had originally been. He thought to himself that he had returned. Looking around, he noticed that Jared and Ernado had also returned. The Death Knight turned to Yuri and remarked that it seemed he had a good dream. Yuri asked what had just happened. The Death Knight replied that it was Eric's plan, something he had left behind for a future heir of Briole who would one day come seeking this place. Yuri thought back to his past life. In that life, the Sword Mountain had been completely destroyed by the Empire. Because of that, no one from the royal family of Briole had been able to reach this place. He then asked the Death Knight if the founder, Eric, had used that mana method. The Death Knight replied that Eric had not. The method was, in fact, the last legacy Eric had left behind, a culmination of all the enlightenment he had gained during his final years roaming the East. Yuri was the first person to inherit it. Curious, Yuri asked why such a technique had been hidden down in the south inside a dungeon, rather than being passed directly to the royal family. The Death Knight explained that the dungeon would not open unless the time was right. Its very opening signaled that the time to use that power had come. Yuri asked when that time would be. The Death Knight said that was not his question to answer, Yuri would have to discover that for himself. When Yuri asked the name of the mana method, the Death Knight answered that it was called Soul Severance. Then, with a grave tone, the Death Knight told Yuri to kneel. He would now pass the legacy of Yuri's ancestors to him. Yuri knelt. The Death Knight placed his hand gently on Yuri's head and told him never to fear his enemies, to act upon his beliefs, and to fulfill Briole's ideals to the very end. Then he grabbed Yuri's hair, pulled his face closer, and with solemn weight declared that Briole never abandoned its honor, even if it meant death. That was the Briole oath. And with those final words, the Death Knight vanished into the air. Some time later, early in the morning, Aina called Yuri to wake up. Light poured into the room from the window, and Yuri slowly opened his eyes. Aina asked if he was tired since he had come home so late the previous night. Yuri replied that he had visited the royal palace archive. Curious, Aina asked why he had suddenly gone there. Yuri told her that he had been looking for a specific record. In those archives, he had found a hidden piece of history, an old note revealing that the founder, Eric Briole, had a brother. A man who had cast away his honor and vanished from history without even leaving his name. Yuri now believed that this man was the Death Knight, the original owner of the sword he had discovered. Aina then reminded Yuri to change quickly, as his father was asking for him. When Yuri asked why, Aina admitted she didn't know the reason, but mentioned that after meeting with Sir Ernado, his father had summoned him immediately. At that, Yuri recalled what had happened that night. Ernado had told him that he would report everything to His Majesty. When Yuri had asked if that was really necessary, Ernado had simply replied that he believed it was. Yuri sighed and placed a hand on his forehead, realizing that Ernado must have gone through with it. At the palace, Yuri asked his father if he had summoned him. His father confirmed that Ernado had told him everything. Not only had Yuri left the palace without permission, but he had also found the founder's dungeon at Sword Mountain. Yuri explained that things had simply turned out that way. His father then asked if he had found the sword in that dungeon as well. Yuri confirmed it. His father went on to say that he had heard Yuri had changed a great deal, from his personal maid to Bernard, Jared, and now even Ernado. His father then asked for the reason behind this sudden transformation. Yuri said nothing. Instead, he gripped his sword tightly and slowly took a step back. His father noticed and asked if he didn't want to tell him. Yuri replied quietly that it wasn't that. Then why, his father asked, was he stepping back with a gloomy expression and clenched fists? He asked again what had happened. After a long pause, Yuri finally said that he had a dream. A dream? His father repeated. Yuri looked down and said that in that dream, he had committed a great crime. Yuri's father looked at him quietly and asked what sin he had committed in that dream. Yuri lowered his gaze and replied that it was the sin of failing to protect Briole until the very end. In that dream, the kingdom had been engulfed in a terrible war, and countless people had been slaughtered. He had tried to turn the tide, but his efforts had ultimately failed. After the royal hall had fallen, he had fled without honor and died in disgrace. When he awoke from that dream, the necklace his mother had once given him was gone. That made him wonder, perhaps the dream hadn't just been a dream, but a warning from his mother. His father then asked what had caused the kingdom's fall in that dream. Yuri hesitated. He thought it was too early to mention the empire. Since he was currently altering the past, there was still a chance the Empire might not invade this time. So instead, he told his father that he wasn't sure. It had been an army he couldn't identify. His father responded thoughtfully. He said he wasn't certain whether what Yuri had seen was a nightmare or a true warning sent by his late wife, but regardless of which it was, he was simply glad that Yuri seemed to be doing better now. Yuri, however, questioned inwardly whether he truly was doing better, or if he was just desperately trying to repent for the sins of his previous life. His father interrupted his thoughts, saying there was one more matter they needed to address, and asked Yuri to bring his sword. They soon arrived at a sacred place, the personal training hall of Fiore Briole, a legendary figure who had wielded a sword as soon as he could stand on his own 2 feet. Known as a genius, Fiore had been the first in countless paths and had engraved his name into the continent's history through sheer martial prowess. At this point in time, he was said to be the strongest among the top 10 warriors of the continent, in other words, the most powerful swordmaster alive. Standing inside this revered hall, Yuri could hardly believe he was truly there. He told his father that it was his first time entering his training grounds. His father admitted that he had never expected any of his sons to possess talent in swordsmanship. Yuri answered that he believed he was actually quite talented. At that, his father raised his own sword and pointed it at Yuri, then asked, "How do you define a swordsman's talent? Is it strength? Speed? Reflexes? Or perhaps wisdom?" He paused and continued, "If someone possesses all of those, does that alone make them a great swordsman?" Then he shook his head. "No," he said firmly. Yuri was taken aback by that response. His father then said that above all, the most important thing was something else, an element capable of pushing a person beyond their limits. Something stronger than fear or duty. Then, his father released his aura. Yuri stood speechless, overwhelmed by the pressure and the transformation. The atmosphere around his father changed drastically, and Yuri could feel the intensity rise like a tidal wave. His father looked at him and said he wasn't sure how to describe it. But perhaps the word calling would be most fitting. Yuri gripped his sword and asked quietly, "Is it something like fate?" His father replied that he didn't know. It might be. Or it might not. As Yuri looked down at the blade in his hands, he reflected on his past life. Back then, he hadn't been fated to walk the path of a swordsman. But what about this life? Could things be different now? His father asked him directly, "What do you think? Do you believe you're fated to wield the sword? Can you hear a calling toward it? In the distant future, when death stands before you, do you think you'll still be holding a sword in your hands?" Yuri hesitated. His grip tightened slightly, and he admitted that he didn't feel anything. Then he glanced up at his father, and fear took root in his heart. He felt like multiple eyes were watching him from all directions. Whispers filled his ears, some urging him to run, others begging for salvation. He was no longer in the training hall. He stood before a burning castle, the once proud citadel of Briole reduced to ash and flame. The Empire's soldiers were massacring civilians without mercy. And he could hear someone, no, many, calling his name. They cried that he was the last remaining friend of the Fallen Kingdom. Yuri looked around in shock. Was this the Empire's doing? Looking down at himself, he wondered why he was back here again. Why, was Briole on fire? Was he reliving the siege of the past? The flames roared louder. The cries of the dying echoed in his ears.